Okay, so we're going to start the information for practical 3. The practical 3 is going to be over the skeletal system. So if you go into your Canvas lab class, go down to week 7, and you click open your practical 3 study guide. That's what we're using here. So this is the practical 3 study guide covering the skeletal system. You can classify bones based on shape. In picture A here, the first classification of bones we have are sutural bones. Sutural bones are going to be bones that are formed between the suture lines in the skull. Then B, this classification of bone is called an irregular bone, meaning that its shape kind of defies description. So if you can't really describe the shape of that bone, it is an irregular bone. So your vertebrate will be a irregular bone. These hip bones right here, called your coxal bones. So this hip bone here called a coxal bone, and this hip bone here called a coxal bone. Those are also irregular bones. Then in C down here, you have your short bones. Short bones are kind of boxy shaped bones, almost like cube shape. You're going to find short bones in the carpal bones of the wrist and the tarsal bones of the ankles. So your carpal bones and your tarsal bones will all be short bones. Then up here in D, you have flat bones. Your flat bones are going to have 2 parallel surfaces, and these will be bones of the top of the skull, the ribs, and the sternum. So the top of the skull here, if we take this piece of bone right here in the top of the skull, we cut it out and we blow it up right here. This is called the parietal bone, and you'll see it has one surface up here and it has a parallel surface here. So being it has 2 parallel surfaces, this is a flat bone. And again, your flat bones are going to be found up here in the skull bones, right here in the sternum, which is your breastbone, and then your ribs. All of those are flat bones. Then in E, you have another classification of bone. This is your long bone. Long bones are longer than they are wide. And these are going to be all the bones of the arms and the legs, as well as the fingers and the toes. So all of the bones of the arms and the legs and the fingers of the toes can be classified as long bones. Then the last classification of bone is called a sesamoid bone. A sesamoid bone is a bone that is found within ligaments. So it's totally encased in ligaments. That is a sesamoid bone. So your kneecap, called a patella, that kneecap is called a sesamoid bone. Okay, then you have the long bone. This is the structure of a long bone in figure A here. So this area of the bone, all of this area right here, also called the shaft, this is the diaphysis. So the shaft of a long bone is a diaphysis. The ends of the long bone is called the epiphysis. So this is an epiphysis and this is an epiphysis. In between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is an area called the metaphysis. Meta means in the middle. Okay. So again, the areas of the long bone, areas here. If I ask you what this area is here that makes up the shaft, that area is the diaphysis. If I ask you what area this is circled in red, top and bottom here, it's the epiphysis. And if I ask you what the areas circled in purple are, that's the metaphysis. Okay, then your long bone is made up of 2 different types of bone. Up here, this area of bone in here, all of this and all of this down here, looks kind of like a loofah. That is going to be spongy bone. It's very airy. Then you have all of this bone that makes up the sides of this long bone. It's very dense bone. This is compact bone. So again, this type of bone seen at the ends in the epiphysis, this type of bone here is going to be your spongy bone. And all this bone that makes up the sides of the shaft is going to be compact bone. Okay, then you have this space in the middle of your long bone. So this entire space here where your bone marrow is going to be, that space is called the medullary cavity. So that space is called the medullary cavity. That's where your bone marrow is going to be. Then found within this inside space, you have an inside protective covering on that bone. That inside protective covering right there is called your endosteum. So, oops. So this skin covering this inside space, so all that skin going all the way down, that is your endosteum. And then around the outside of this bone, covering the outside surface, is a protective covering called the periosteum. So the endosteum is the inside protective connective tissue covering. And the protective covering on the, I don't know which one I just said, sorry. The protective connective tissue covering around the outside of the bone is the periosteum. And the protective connective tissue lining of the inside of the bone is called the endosteum. Okay. So I'm going to pull the picture to the middle because I'm going to show you a long bone here. So this is a long bone. And we're going to identify these structures that we just talked about on this long bone. So what is this area of the bone and this area of the bone? Right where my fingers are covering. Those areas of the bone are going to be your epiphysis. What is all this area of the bone called? This area of the bone is called the diaphysis. Now, what are the areas of bone that my fingers are lying on? That area of the bone is called the metaphysis. What is this protective layer or the protective covering right here? It's on the inside. So this protective covering or protective lining is endosteum. This is around the outside of the bone. What is this protective layer or covering around the outside of the bone called? That's my periosteum. Turning it back around so you can see the cut open inside of the bone. What is this space right here called? That space right there is the medullary cavity. What is this type of bone? This type of bone is your compact bone. What is this type of bone? So you see those air spaces in there, kind of looks like a loofah. This type of bone found in the epiphysis or the ends of the long bone. This type of bone is spongy bone. So this is spongy bone. This is compact bone. Okay. And those are the structures you need to know on the long bone. Then going over here to, let me move my picture off the middle of the screen now. Going over here to picture B. Picture B is the structure of a flat bone. And here we're looking at the flat bone of the skull. So if we take that flat bone, remember your flat bone is going to have two parallel surfaces. Each of those parallel surfaces are called the cortex. And your cortex surfaces are made up of your compact bone. In between those cortexes of compact bone, you have this network of spongy bone. So that network of spongy bone is called your diploid. So again, the structure of your flat bone, you have the two parallel cortex surfaces made up of compact bone. And in between those two parallel cortex structures, you have the diploid made up of your spongy bone. So if I put a sticker right here, whoops, let me get my little pen back. If I have a sticker right here and I say number 1, What is that structure called? That structure is called the cortex. But what if I have that number 1 there and I say, what is this bone? What type of bone is this? That type of bone is compact bone. Now, what if I have number 2 in here? Oh, let me get a different color. You can't hardly see that. So number 2 is in here. What if I ask you, what is this structure called? This structure is your diploid. Or if I say right there at number 2, what is that type of bone? That type of bone is spongy bone. This picture here is to show you a few more structures associated with long bones. So right here on this end, you'll see this blue pillow of cartilage. That is called your articular cartilage. It's made up of hyaline cartilage, and it forms little pillows on the ends of your bone. Okay, so that would be articular cartilage or hyaline cartilage. Then you have this structure seen right here. That structure is the epiphyseal line. So before puberty, this epiphyseal line is made up of cartilage that allows for those bones to grow in length as you get older. But after puberty, those lines or that band of cartilage is going to be replaced by bone. Once it's replaced by bone, it is called an epiphyseal plate. So before puberty, it's a band of cartilage, and that band of cartilage would be called epiphyseal. I'm just going to abbreviate here, epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal plate is a band of cartilage before puberty. And after puberty, when that epiphyseal plate of cartilage is replaced by bone cells, then it's called the epiphyseal line. Also remember from the previous slide, all this bone found in this epiphysis, so all this bone here is going to be spongy bone. And then the bone down here that makes up the shaft is your compact bone. Inside that compact bone, you have a space called the medullary cavity. Around the outside of that long bone, you have a protective connective tissue covering called the periosteum. And on the inside of that medullary cavity, you have a protective connective tissue